Welcome to today's Masterclass Explainer. I'm your host, and today we're going to completely shatter the illusion that ancient Egypt was just born fully formed, complete with towering pyramids, golden pharaohs, and complex hieroglyphs. We tend to think of history as starting on page 1 of a textbook, but today we're uncovering the fascinating, kinda messy, and deeply human truth of the time before recorded history. So, grab your notebooks, because we are digging deep into the dirt of pre-dynastic Egypt. Here's the syllabus for our journey today. We'll start before history with mobile tent rings, check out the early settlements of Lower Egypt and the cultural rise of Upper Egypt, examine the trade and conflict that sparked early cities, and finally culminate in the dramatic unification of the First Dynasty. Let's get right into it. Okay, before we get our hands dirty in the archaeological record, let's define our times like good historians. The pre-dynastic period refers to this massive span of unwritten history, generally running from around 6000 to 3150 BCE. Now, because this era was named way before we had fully mapped out all the archaeological finds, the timeline can be kind of tricky. You might actually hear some of my colleagues in academia argue for calling the very tail end of this period the proto-dynastic period or even the Zero Dynasty. But hey, whether you call it pre-dynastic or Zero Dynasty, the absolute crucial takeaway is that this is the fertile soil from which the greatest empire of the ancient world grew.
Section 1. Before recorded history. We're traveling back to Paleolithic origins, a time when survival meant constantly moving.
The sheer scale of early human habitation here is just staggering. We're talking about evidence going back potentially 700,000 years. But let's focus in on the 40th millennium BCE. Down in ancient Nubia, around modern-day Sudan, hunter-gatherers left behind something truly remarkable: man-made depressions with stone floors, which we call tent rings. These mobile campsites basically allowed nomadic people to set up shelters with animal skins and brush, then just easily pack up and move on. From these humble, temporary circles in the sand, we eventually see a massive leap around 9000 BCE in the Fayum Oasis, where people actually began transitioning to farming. And this brilliantly illustrates a core problem we face in archaeology. As Professor Douglas J. Brewer points out, the shift from chasing herds to planting wheat in the Fayum Depression remains one of our most profound mysteries. We know that they transitioned from Paleolithic hunter-gatherers to Neolithic sedentary farmers. But the how and the why? Well, those are still obscured by the sands of time. What we do know for sure is that once they settled down, human ingenuity went into absolute overdrive.
Moving on to Section 2, Lower Egypt's early settlements. So how exactly did we get from temporary desert campsites to massive, permanent structures in the north?
This step-by-step evolution beautifully illustrates the technological leap in Lower Egypt, which, remember, is the northern part of Egypt, up near the Mediterranean. Think about this progression. We go from those mobile tent rings to the Fayum A culture building reed huts with actual underground storage cellars for their grain. Then, the Merminda culture upgrades to pole-framed huts with windbreaks. And by the time we hit the Mahdi culture around 4000 BCE, we aren't just talking about huts anymore. We're looking at large, sophisticated buildings constructed with underground chambers, stairs, and hearths. And here's a fascinating detail for you. Prior to this, people usually buried their dead right under or near their homes. But during the Mahdi period, they established dedicated community cemeteries. That is a massive shift in how a society organizes itself and views the dead.
Section 3, Upper Egypt's cultural rise. While Lower Egypt was busy building cellars and cemeteries, let's shift our focus south to Upper Egypt. Civilization develops slightly later here, but with an absolute explosion of culture.
What's truly fascinating here is the sheer speed of development. In Upper Egypt, we progress through distinct archaeological cultures, named after the sites where their artifacts were dug up. We start with the Badarian culture around 4500 BCE, which gives way to the Amrachian, or Naqada I period, and then the Gurzian, or Naqada II period. Across this timeline, we see incredible artistic milestones. They shift from simple, yet really finely crafted black topware ceramics to highly decorated red ceramics, painted with images of people, animals, and boats. Art was no longer just functional, you see. It was becoming a canvas for their entire worldview.
But I want you to think about this as way more than just a change in pottery styles. Consider the Badarian shift. What does it tell us when a society starts burying their dead wrapped in animal hides, accompanied by food, throwing sticks, and finely crafted ceramics? Well, as an educator, this is the exact moment I point out to my students this signifies a massive, fundamental shift in human belief. It strongly indicates they now thought material goods were absolutely necessary for a journey into the afterlife. The foundational religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, That obsession with the next world literally began right here in the dirt of the Predynastic Era.
And the momentum only builds. By the Naqada II period, we're seeing the architectural and spiritual blueprints of the Egypt we all recognize today. We see the very beginnings of mummification around 3500 BCE. We see mass-produced pottery for trade. Houses are now built from sun-baked brick, some even featuring courtyards. And perhaps most critically, we see the construction of ornate tombs at a place called Abydos, which would eventually grow into a massive necropolis. It's also in this window, between 3400 and 3200 BCE, that the first labels written in early hieroglyphic script are found on bone and ivory pieces. The dawn of Egyptian writing is officially upon us.
Which brings us to Section 4, Trade, Cities, and Conflict. History is rarely just a peaceful upward trajectory of art and architecture, right? As we enter the Naqada III period, that proto-dynastic period we defined earlier, our narrative takes a pretty dramatic turn towards warfare.
Consider this for a second. What happens when lucrative trade routes bring vast new wealth to small agricultural communities? Well, the answer, historically speaking, is almost always conflict. During this time, significant influence from Mesopotamia and Canaan began pouring into Egypt. We see Mesopotamian methods in brickmaking, cylinder seals, and even tomb symbolism. As this trade flourished, populations boomed. Small, peaceful villages rapidly transformed into fiercely competitive, fortified urban centers, all fighting over two absolutely critical resources: trade goods and water.
The archaeological record shows a fierce, multi-generational struggle for dominance. Upper Egypt consolidated into three major city-states: Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen. It was a brutal era of conquest. The evidence suggests Thinis ultimately conquered Naqada and then absorbed Nekhen. And who led these campaigns? A mysterious lineage of pre-dynastic rulers known today as the Scorpion Kings. Specifically, leaders identified as Scorpion I, Scorpion II, and a ruler known as Ka. These weren't mythological figures, folks. They were very real military commanders carving out kingdoms in the Nile Valley.
Section 5, Unification and First Dynasty. This brings us to the climax of our masterclass today, the ultimate unification of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single powerhouse state and the true beginning of recorded history. Here we hit a massive historical debate, and it's actually a perfect example of why we have to cross-reference our sources. On one hand, we have the account of Manetho, a scribe writing in the 3rd century BCE, which is thousands of years after the fact. He claims a king named Menes peacefully united the two lands of Egypt and built the great capital of Memphis. But on the other hand, we have the contemporary archaeological record. Physical artifacts dug straight from the earth from that exact era tell a completely different story about a king named Narmer.
So the crucial question is, what does the contemporary evidence actually say? When we look directly at the primary source, specifically the famous Narmer palette, a 64-centimeter inscribed slab, we don't see anything resembling peace treaties or diplomatic handshakes. No way. We see a military leader, King Narmer, physically subjugating his enemies, violently bringing the land to heel to forge the first dynasty.
Now, most modern scholars lean towards the idea that Narmer and Menes might actually be the exact same person, or perhaps Horaha was Menes. But regardless of whether unification was forged primarily by diplomacy or by the sword, this singular event changed the world. By uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, this great king established a centralized government, closing the book on the pre-dynastic period. This sparked the early dynastic period, initiating a highly organized, deeply religious, and monumentally powerful culture that would dominate the ancient world for the next 3 millennia.
Which brings us to a final thought for today's class. If the foundation of Egypt's legendary 3,000-year reign, the era of pyramids and pharaohs, was actually built on obscured warfare, shifting climates, and disputed kings that we are only just now digging out of the sand, what other established histories might just be stories waiting to be debunked by the dirt? I want to leave you with that thought to ponder. Always question the first page of the history book. Thank you so much for joining this explainer on the incredible, messy, and fascinating era before history began. I'll see you in the next one.